So Fast X, aka Fast and Furious 10, is coming out in May. So I thought it'd be a good time to go back and revisit all of the Fast and the Furious movies. Some of these movies I have actually not seen yet. I saw some of them, but there's some I didn't see. So I want to make sure I catch up with all of them before the last one comes out. From what we understand, the movie coming out in May, Fast 10, is not the last one, but it's the beginning of a two-part saga. So the movie's going to end with some kind of cliffhanger, and then the big finale is going to be, I think next year, they're going to release Fast 11, which is going to be the last one. It's really the 12th Fast movie because don't forget the Hobbs and Shaw one. But I want to go all the way back to 2001 today, and we're going to review the very first movie in the franchise, a very different movie than what it would become. The Fast and the Furious from 2001, starring Paul Walker and Vin Diesel. Interestingly enough, when you look at this film and you compare it even to movies like Fast 5 and Furious 6, you notice that it's a drastically different movie. Very, very different. First of all, Paul Walker was the main character. If you look at the first two Fast movies, it was supposed to be a Paul Walker franchise. You know, he is like the main guy, whereas Vin Diesel's like the co-star. And it's not until Fast and Furious, the fourth one, that they really decided to shift gears, no pun intended. That's a good pun. That's a good pun. You know what? Pun intended. Screw you. They're shifting gears and going over to having Vin Diesel be the main character, which, to be honest, in a weird way was ominous considering what happened to Paul Walker and his unfortunate passing. But we'll talk more about that when we get to those movies. Let's go back to the very first one. So this movie started, like the whole idea behind this film is it was supposed to be a street racing film, not a big heist, you know, super action drama, somewhat fantasy, fantastical like the sequels became later on down the road. This was supposed to be just a crazy love fest towards exotic fast vehicles, you know. And the movie's based on an article that was written, I think in like the late 90s. I don't really know the details of it, called Racer X, basically about the street racing scene. Now, there was a very brief time in my life, very brief, when I was into the street racing scene. I know I might not seem like it, I don't really ever talk about it, but there's a fun fact about me. I was into it. I love exotic cars. I'm not an expert on them. I can't just list off stuff like McLarens and Ferraris and stuff like that, like off the top of my head, like some other people can. I mean, I love the vehicles though. They're beautiful. Like exotic cars with candy paint is some of the most beautiful machinery that mankind has ever made. You know, and this movie, all the movies do it, but really the first few really do put the spotlight on the beautiful cars and vehicles that were around back then. And even for 2001, we probably got some people watching this who were born either right before or right after this movie, young people who are, you know, late teens, early 20s, who don't understand that beautiful cars have been a thing about America going back, you know, decades, right? So you might see a new Bugatti now in 2023, but if you go back and look at the cars from 2001, they were just as gorgeous. I mean, really. This film was a lot of people's first time understanding and seeing the underground street racing scene and really car aficionados. It's not the first movie ever made to do this, but it was a lot of people's first time, and it came out just at the right time in 2001. You know, in 2001, I was in high school, and what was happening at that time in the world is we were kind of shifting away, no pun intended, from like the controversial raunchy 90s with stuff like South Park and Jerry Springer, and we were going into the 2000s, which really became the 2000s. I feel with the internet sort of growing became kind of like a decade of flashiness and sizzle over steak in many ways, whereas I feel the 80s was more steak over sizzle, for better or for worse. So I think this movie really was, it really came out at the right time. So the story behind this movie, like I said, compared to the later films, it really is a very humble and meek film. Like, it's funny because this movie has like a crazy final action sequence that when it first dropped back in 2001 was nuts. I mean, the scene where they drive the car under the truck and go to the other side. That scene blew my mind when I first saw it. Even to this day, it blows my mind. And like, you gotta understand, that's a stunt that I would love to actually do in real life, to actually take a car and slide under a truck to the other side in between the two, the wheels. But I don't have the balls to do it because that's a recipe for disaster, yo. You do that in real life, you're done if you don't do it right. So don't try this at home. So as I was saying, the story of this movie is very meek and humble. It stars Paul Walker, who plays Brian O'Connor, and he would go on to play that character for each subsequent sequel that he was in. And he's an FBI, or I'm sorry, an LAPD officer. I think he gets hired by the FBI to infiltrate and investigate these car hijackers and sort of get into the underground racing scene. So he's supposed to be an underground agent going into this underground scene to try to find out who it was that committed the crime at the beginning of the movie, who hijacked this car. You know what I'm saying? And he ends up meeting Vin Diesel. He ends up meeting Dominic Toretto, played by Vin Diesel. And this is a guy who, he's played up like the alpha male of the underground racing circuit. He's got a whole crew with him. He has a history of hurting people violently, which the movie does kind of explain why he did it. It's funny because the movie, this is a well-written film, yo. I think a lot of people forget that. This movie, we'll worry about the other ones later, is actually a pretty well-written film. Like the story of Dominic Toretto, how they build him up as being this sort of like scary street guy, like this sort of like a mafia don of the underground. And they kind of play with you during the movie, making you think that he's going to end up being the villain. And then when you hear the real story about how he attacked a guy who killed his father, like when you hear that story later in the film and why he did it and what was going through his mind, you all of a sudden feel sympathy for him. And that's super well written. Like, that is super duper well done for this movie. I can't believe I said super duper, but it is what it is. Michelle Rodriguez plays his girlfriend, Letty Ortiz. She would, of course, come back for some sequels, but in this one, she didn't do much. She was just kind of there. And then we have Jordana Brewster as Mia Toretto. And what happens is Mia Toretto and Brian O'Connor start this kind of, this kind of romance. You know what I mean? This little romance, and he takes her out on dates and this and that. So what's happening here is Brian, who's supposed to be doing his job as a cop, is starting to catch feelings for Dominic's sister. So things are getting complicated because even though he's a cop, he's starting to grow attachment to these people. And he's starting to realize that Dominic Toretto's not that bad of a guy. Like, that's the thing about this movie, dude. Like, there's some real good character development and some good writing because you don't really know. If you're watching it for the first time and you haven't seen any of the sequels and you're doing it right, you're not supposed to know what happens. You're not supposed to know that Dominic Toretto ends up having a bigger crew in later movies and really does some impressive stuff. He's just kind of a street racer here, and he's shrouded in mystery for most of the film until later on. I really like this movie, dude. I think it's super underrated. I feel like because of how over the top and explosive the sequels get and how each new movie raises the bar and brings in more actors like The Rock and Jason Statham and all these guys, this movie just feels different. Like, it feels more like a film. I should mention too that this franchise went from being a love letter to street racing, because this movie does have racing in it, actual racing in it, and the movie, by the way, feels very early 2000s. Like, if you were around back then, this movie is shot and looks like the super colorful music videos of the early 2000s. Like, if you were around back then, you know what I'm talking about. If you weren't, go back and watch some early 2000s music videos. Like, you'll understand. Like, this movie really feels like that. But like I said, the franchise really had its roots in street racing and in really showing you these beautiful vehicles that wind up, many of them wind up getting destroyed. Like you see stuff like a 1970 Dodge Charger. Of course, these things are souped up to the gills here. A 94 Toyota Supra, which is a beautiful freaking car. I love that car. 95 Mitsubishi Eclipse. Like, these are cars that are so gorgeous to look at, and you learn about NOS, nitric oxide. You learn about like just the whole scene, and the thing about the street racing scene is, while it was getting big here, it actually got big in Japan as well, which is why we have stuff like Initial D, and of course Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, the third movie. Like, that's obvious because of that reason. Like, the Japanese street racing scene kind of borrowed from the American street racing scene, from what I understand. I think there's a deeper story there. And so you had certain cities in the country that were really deep into this stuff. I mean, and it was cool and expensive. It's an expensive and dangerous hobby. That's the thing. It is dangerous. I had a friend a long time ago who he actually not only got into this scene, but actually souped up his car, beautiful neon lights. And then they made a law at some point that you can't have neon lights or something like that. You can't have a certain color. I think you can't have blue or red because it confused people with the cops, something like that. I don't remember, to be honest. This is a long, long time ago. But nevertheless, I like Paul Walker's character. I like that he's a genuine guy, growing feelings for Dominic Toretto's sister. I like that Dominic Toretto kind of has a soft spot for him. Like, it really does. The movie really does sort of set the groundwork for what would be their relationship in future Fast movies. And I can't wait to go through the franchise and talk with you guys about it as we build up to the final Fast and the Furious, which might actually be called Final Fast. I think it's coming out next year. But in the meantime, I am going to go see Fast 10, and I'll probably review it here on the channel. So stay tuned for that. Again, the movie it's a well-written film. It's got great characters. The villain is Johnny Tran. He's a pretty fun villain, I would say. He's not... There's way better over-the-top villains in later movies, and I mean way better. He's just kind of like a very simple guy. Also, the soundtrack to this movie is so early 2000s, dude. You've got Ja Rule on this thing. You've got music from that era. It's kind of funny. Like, it's kind of funny when you watch this, because I lived through that era, and this was the time when I was actually super into like BET and MTV and things like that. So there is a lot of nostalgia here. The movie definitely is well paced. It's got fun action sequences. And again, I think people are going to understand that it doesn't have what future movies have. Like, obviously the bigger ones have much bigger set pieces. But nonetheless, this movie for its time is great. And it's still one of the better written Fast and Furious movies. And those are my thoughts on the very first movie, The Fast and the Furious. Which, by the way it was written does not really lend itself to a sequel. You can tell when they wrote the movie that there was no intention of making it into a franchise. It was just supposed to be one film, and it has a beginning, middle, and end. I love the ending, because the ending is kind of like... The ending is a good payoff to what they had built up in the movie, and an exciting sequence. I actually was tempted to try this one day in real life. I'm not even making that up, dude. I drive a sports car. I don't know if y'all knew that. I drive a Kia. But yeah, I like this movie. It's fun. And it began this huge franchise. That's it, folks. Take care. I'll see you guys in the next one as we talk about Too Fast, Too Furious.